Chapter 11 of Tiberius Caesar by George Philip Baker. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 11. The Entanglement of Julia's Children and the Fall of the Tuscan. 1. If the old man had reckoned that his absence from Rome would betray young Nero into showing, whether for good or ill, his true nature, he was right in his calculation. The friends of Agrippina seemed to think the departure of Caesar a retreat. In the strange freedom of Rome, they began with confidence to lift up their heads. But Tiberius had left behind him eyes as keen and as watchful as his own. If Agrippina and her sons elected to wander from the straight path of rectitude, the Tuscan was waiting, and he would not miss that prey. The tale of the process by which he caught them is a complex one, with dark interludes wherein the modern historian can but grope at large. As the Romans themselves told the story, it began with a delator, Latinius Latiaris, and 3 friends who wanted the consulship. Sejanus disposed of the necessary patronage, and accordingly they directed their attention first to him. It is evident that they already possessed private information of a nature which would interest him to the highest degree, and the power of patronage held by the Tuscan was the means by which he secured this information for Tiberius and himself. Latiaris and his syndicate, which included Fulcinius' trio, were at any rate aware that Titus Sabinus, a friend and devotee of Agrippina, had important schemes on foot. As soon as their price was agreed upon, they set to work upon the case. By suitable advances, Sabinus was induced to talk, and when he had sufficiently revealed his plans, he was induced to commit himself in the presence of hidden witnesses. The evidence was then sent to Tiberius, who communicated it to the Senate. The news of the arrest of Sabinus had some very strange effects in Rome. The state of panic-stricken distrust and suspicion which immediately followed would seem to show that a large number of important people had only too much reason to fear the inquiries of the delator. An outward show of confidence was restored only when they began to be conscious that their apprehensions betrayed them. The account given by the friends of Sabinus is that he was charged merely with having expressed outspoken opinions of Caesar for his cruel and unfeeling treatment of the unhappy Agrippina. The official communication which reached the Senate from Capri put a very different complexion upon the matter. Sabinus was charged with tampering with the servants of Tiberius and with conspiracy against his life. Precisely how much Tiberius revealed in his message is uncertain. It was at least sufficient to secure the immediate condemnation of Sabinus, and in the promptitude, even the haste with which the execution was dispatched by the Senate, there is a suggestion that influential persons were very much afraid that Sabinus, forsaken by his friends, might in despair make further inconvenient revelations on his own account. Tiberius sent a further message to the Senate. In returning thanks, he hinted that he still feared danger to his life, and though he mentioned no names, the allusion was evidently to Agrippina and Nero. But how much did Tiberius know? There must have been many men who would have given a good deal to discover that. They found a spokesman in Asinius Gallus, who rose to suggest that Caesar should confide his grounds of apprehension to the Senate and allow it to deal with them. This disingenuous proposal that he should disclose to the very persons most concerned the full extent of the incriminating evidence in his possession attracted the angry attention of Tiberius. Sejanus diverted his wrath. There were, at any rate from the Tuscan's point of view, more important issues at stake than the debating points scored by Asinius Gallus during a life-and-death struggle for empire. The truth would seem to be that Nero and Agrippina had both been implicated by the evidence obtained. But to make the real heads of these conspiracies amenable to the law was extremely difficult. Their devoted friends were ready to take the risk of acting on their behalf. Even against Nero, the evidence was more circumstantial than direct. To secure the trial of Agrippina and Nero, it might be necessary to substitute a technical charge which could be substantiated for the real one which could not be. But this could never be done while Livia Augusta was alive. She remained a firm barrier in the way, and the alienation of Tiberius did not induce her to change her attitude. 2. During the tense interval which followed the execution of Sabinus, the relationship of the parties was strained. It was still impossible to make out how much Tiberius knew. Nero grew somewhat reckless. He spoke openly against Tiberius and took little trouble to conceal his embittered hostility. The friends of Caesar treated Nero with mingled coldness and contempt. There were not many who cared to show him any degree of cordiality. Tiberius himself seemed self-conscious and avoided noticing the extent to which Nero was cold-shouldered by his supporters. The matter could not remain permanently in this condition. The first event which altered the balance of affairs would see a violent crisis. The interesting feature of the day was the glory and magnitude of the Tuscan. His splendid orb began to eclipse the sun of Caesar, which was the sun and which the satellite became, indeed, a problem which troubled the minds of men. The Senate voted altars to clemency and to friendship, beside which stood statues of Tiberius and Sejanus, a novel pair of heavenly twins. It solemnly requested them to allow themselves to be more frequently seen. Apparently, they split the difference. Sejanus was willing enough to shine before men. Tiberius did not see the necessity. So instead of going to Rome, they paid a visit to Campania. Everyone who could go hastened to wait upon them, especially upon Sejanus. Senators, equites, and more common persons camped in the fields and besieged the Tuscan's door. But to get at Sejanus was difficult. He was becoming accessible only to those who were willing to commit themselves to his cause, and even this could be effected only by buying or fighting or cajoling a way through the crowd of competitors. If Tiberius missed any of this, then the less Tiberius he. The man would have been dull who failed to notice that the throne of Caesar was being contested by two groups of protagonists. Very ordinary persons were able to perceive it, and many of them thought that Caesar would readily fall before the victor. Caesar himself had become the doubtful, the problematic factor. He was, after all, a very old man. He was 70 years of age this year. 3. When Livia Augusta died at the age of 86, the principal difficulties were swept from the path of Sejanus. The depth of the dissension between her and her son is visible from his conduct. He did not visit her during her last illness. After her death, although he expressed the intention of seeing her so that they waited several days in anticipation of his arrival, he did not come, and it became necessary to carry out the funeral without further delay. He wrote explaining that he was detained by urgent public business. Her funeral oration was spoken by her great-grandson Gaius, better known by his nickname of Caligula. Tiberius damped the expression of extraordinary honor towards the wife of Augustus. The Senate was refused permission to deify her. The funeral was quiet. He disregarded her will and left it unexecuted. The Tuscan must have been happy to observe that Caesar apparently did not endorse those views which his mother had held. But precisely what views Caesar did or did not endorse had become a problem perilous to guess at. That the Senate was by no means entirely subservient to Tiberius is visible in its conduct with respect to Livia. It did not confine itself merely to the program he recommended. While it politely acknowledged the propriety of putting public business before private grief, it proceeded to vote a year's mourning and an arch in her honor, which was a tribute never before paid to any woman. Tiberius undertook to build the arch at his own expense. As he never did, the arch was never erected. 4. Sejanus acted with promptitude, perhaps too great promptitude. He began to feel himself in control, and feelings of this kind are always a dangerous luxury. Tiberius was ready to take the step on which such great issues depended. A message, therefore, came to the Senate from Capri. Agrippina was charged with insolent language and refractory temper. Nero, not with conspiracy, but with immoral habits. The sensation created by this message was tremendous. It was increased by the absence of any hint concerning the action which Tiberius expected the Senate to take. Like Henry VIII, and for the same reasons, he was determined not to shoulder the entire responsibility for these great measures of state. He intended the Senate to share it with him, but it had many and various reasons for declining to do so. He seemed to be implying that the Senate knew the facts as well as he did, and needed no information. But no one could be sure how much he knew, and to assume the guilt of Nero and Agrippina would be to admit a knowledge which some did not possess, and which others would be the last men to admit that they possessed. Those who were adherents of Agrippina would not readily allow her to be condemned on technical or dummy charges. There were others who were of Caesar's party, but some of these held Livia's views, and they implored the House not to support a policy that Caesar himself might, in the end, bitterly regret. When Marcus Aurelius Cotta, on behalf of Caesar, rose to move a vote of condemnation, senators took refuge in agitated disclaimers. The old man had presented them with a dilemma singularly difficult to face. A popular demonstration was, as it so often is, the only resort. It came to the rescue by parading with the images of Nero and Agrippina, and it provided that useful political speaker a voice to declare that the message of Caesar was a forgery. Bills were circulated containing what purported to be resolutions against Sejanus, moved or to be moved by various eminent senators. The result of this test of public opinion apparently proved disappointing. The appeal to public opinion was indeed a forlorn hope. The men whose views might have mattered were the rank and file of Caesar's own armies, and they, who could not be captured on the Rhine and the Danube, could not be swayed from Rome. Caesar remained unmoved. Sejanus, moreover, was stinging in his retort. He counseled Tiberius that his complaints were being treated with contempt, and he made a damaging reference to the imminent appearance of the realities instead of the effigies at the head of this revolt of the people. Tiberius seems to have agreed, for he sent a second message in which he demanded that if the Senate felt unable to act, it should leave the matter to his discretion. Once it was put to the test, the whole position of Agrippina and her supporters proved to be built on sand. The Senate surrendered and humbly replied that it would endorse any action he might take. 5. Agrippina and Nero were tried, therefore, before Caesar himself, and as few particulars of the trial have survived, it was probably held in camera. Among the charges against Agrippina, which were, of course, denied, was a project of escaping to the army and taking refuge with it. Gnaeus Lentulus Gaetulicus, the commander of the Rhine army, was implicated. He escaped by one of those bold and manly answers which often went down well with Tiberius. He said that he had done nothing against Caesar, but if his own life were in peril, he thought he could do a great deal. No further action was taken against Lentulus. He was popular with the Rhine army, and after his disclaimer, Tiberius elected to let well alone. Agrippina had had a long rope, but this was the end of it. No lettre de cachet ever swept away a dangerous conspirator more effectively than the judgment of Caesar swept away Agrippina and Nero. They were removed, she to Pandateria, and he to Pontia, fettered and in closed litters. Their guards prevented any passers-by from even stopping to look. At Pandateria, her mother's place of imprisonment, the fury of Agrippina broke forth. She spoke the whole of her mind on the subject of Tiberius, but she was in the wrong place for that. Here Caesar's word went without question. There was violence, in which Agrippina lost an eye. When she went on hunger strike, she was forcibly fed. Public opinion thought that the voice might be the voice of Caesar, but the hand was the hand of Sejanus. 2 sons of Germanicus still remained, Drusus and Gaius, both of them kept under the eye of Tiberius himself at Capri. Gaius, an unbalanced, degenerate, baby-faced rat, was too cunning for Sejanus and survived to become the Emperor Caligula. But Drusus, after first being used as a means of trapping Nero, was in his due turn caught in the Tuscan's net. Sejanus intoxicated Lepida, the wife of Drusus, as he had intoxicated Livilla. On her evidence, Drusus was sent back to Rome. This was not enough for Sejanus. At his instigation, the consul Cassius Longinus moved the arrest and imprisonment of Drusus, the second of the name to fall to the Tuscans' wiles. Tiberius surveyed young Gaius. His ominous comment was, quote, "He lives to become the destruction of himself and of other men." End quote. The obstacles in the way of Sejanus were rapidly thinning. At this rate, they would soon have disappeared. The apparent exemption of Gaius was no more than a respite. A brother of Germanicus still survived, Claudius, but he was considered to be of defective intelligence and hardly entered seriously into the question of the succession. He was absorbed in the compilation of a history in many volumes. The Tuscan was on the verge of becoming the one man able to take up the mantle of Caesar, and the time was at hand. 6. But what thoughts and calculations were in the mind of Tiberius at Capri? The Tuscans' work had been accomplished. The children of Julia, who twice had sought to snatch the principate out of his hands, were gone. The senatorial party, whose hope they had been, was paralyzed. He could now at leisure direct his attention to the Tuscan and survey that remarkable figure with the interest it deserved. Sejanus stood to Tiberius in a relation not altogether unlike that in which the latter had stood to Augustus. But there were differences worth noting. Sejanus had not quite given Tiberius those guarantees of fidelity which the latter had given to Augustus. He had never humbly subordinated himself, nor served those years of self-repression which Tiberius had served. He had never retired to Rhodes, nor disinherited his own son for such adopted heirs as Germanicus and Agrippina. A man grows cold with age, and the older Tiberius grew, the less he was likely to relish the strain of lusciousness that marked the Tuscan. Sejanus had bloomed with some of the quality of a tropical orchid. He was a man who did not know how to lose himself in his background. The loyalty of the Tuscan had endured only one kind of test. There had been a famous example of it. Passing through Campania on the way to Capri, Caesar's party had picnicked in a natural grotto. The place was unsafe, and during the meal there had been a fall of rock and a panic. Sejanus had knelt over Tiberius and received on his own shoulders the falling stones which might have killed his master. Such a proof of devotion was gratifying and satisfactory as far as it went. But how far did it go? It meant nothing more than that the life of Tiberius was essential to the Tuscan while heirs to his power still lived. The public opinion of Rome cast an instructive light on the situation. It had no doubt who was the master. Tiberius was supposed to be hidden in Capri with his orgies and his astrologers. The man who swayed destiny was Sejanus. His birthday was publicly observed. Altars were built to him and libations offered. Men swore by the fortune of Sejanus as well as by that of Tiberius. He was in separate and distinct communication with the Senate and the people. The old man at Capri might congratulate himself on possessing a distance and perspective that he would not have had in Rome. The very absence of Tiberius threw into clear visibility facts which might otherwise have remained obscure. There were other alarming features. The Praetorians were, as a matter of course, at the beck and call of their chief. Worse, his influence affected even the private entourage of Caesar. The movements and words of Caesar were regularly reported to him, whereas Tiberius had difficulty in acquiring information respecting the Tuscan. Agrippina was in Panditaria, Nero in Pontia, and if once the slender cord of communication were cut, Tiberius in Capri might be as much a prisoner as they. The policy of Sejanus was now to gain over by friendly means or by intimidation the party which had supported Agrippina. The next step, if ever he took it, would be to cast upon Tiberius the responsibility for the action taken against Agrippina, and so to stand at the head of a coalition of parties before which Tiberius would be isolated. To an observer, indeed, it might very well seem that the position of Tiberius was weaker and more perilous than it had been at any past time. But the old man knew what he was about, and perfect quiet and silence brooded over Capri. 7. The calculation of times and moments might be controlled by the occurrence of definite events on which they depended. The crisis would come with the death of Agrippina and her sons. Tiberius held hostages for himself in their persons, for Sejanus would never attempt to strike him down in face of the prospect that he might put them in his place. Tiberius thus had every reason for preventing Agrippina from destroying herself. When Nero died in Pontia, the first moves in the dangerous game began. Tiberius, with a touch of irony, bestowed the widow of Nero in marriage upon Sejanus. She was his granddaughter, the daughter of his son Drusus. Tiberius resolved to pay Sejanus the honor of holding the consulship in his company. The Tuscan was therefore sent to Rome to take up office on their joint behalf. His influence was now all-powerful, His doors were besieged with callers anxious to register themselves upon the winning side. He enjoyed the sensation of actual supremacy, such as Tiberius had never wielded and had never sought to wield. Men referred to him as the colleague of Tiberius, and not with regard to the consulship alone. One of the ways of killing a cat is to choke it with cream. Silence in Capri. But there a greater and colder and more complex mind than the Tuscans had collided into motion and had begun, like some vast calculating machine, to work out a subtle and intricate reckoning. Tiberius sat in Capri, thinking, but the machine made no sound to betray its working. In the roar and hurry of Rome were hope and fear, doubt and confidence, feverish energy and worried forethought. But perfect calm brooded over the sunlit rocks and turquoise sea of Capri. Things came about by slow degrees. They made their next step, perhaps, when Tiberius, after 5 months, resigned the consulship. Sejanus had to follow suit, and 2 suffecti succeeded in their places. The lead which the old man had now established he kept to the end. It must have instilled into the heart of the Tuscan just that faint spirit of doubt which spurs men on to haste and self-betrayal. In July, Tiberius saw that Lucius Fulcinius Trio was made suffectus. Trio was one of the party of Sejanus. The old man may, in the world's eye, have seemed irresponsible and capricious, but Sejanus was probably better informed. There were omens and portents, some of which, if true, may have been engineered by Tiberius. Tiberius was certainly expert in that art of testing a guilty conscience, which has always been a supreme art in Rome. He very gradually shook the Tuscan's nerve. Although Sejanus was now free from the engagements involved in holding the consulship, he did not return to Capri. Tiberius said that he himself was coming to Rome. He next raised Sejanus to the proconsular power, one of the main powers of the Principate. Having thus encouraged him, he deftly undercut the encouragement by the expedient of bestowing the priesthood upon Sejanus and Gaius Caesar simultaneously. This casting of the imperial mantle over Gaius, a proceeding which mollified Agrippina's party and tended to detach it from the Tuscan, was so ominous that Sejanus grew alarmed. He begged permission to return to Capri to see his bride, who was ill. Tiberius blandly replied that they were all of them just about to visit Rome. A little while after came a message to the Senate in which Sejanus was briefly referred to without any of his titles, and the payment of divine honors to a living man was prohibited. This form of moral stream-whipping brought Sejanus to the surface. He grew convinced that unless he leaped now, he would leap too late. The arrangements were made. Tiberius was to be assassinated when he came to Rome. The old man in Capri must have smiled to himself. He was not going to Rome. 8. Tiberius had not finished yet. His most enticing fly was cast last of all. Only one thing was wanting to place Sejanus on the throne beside Caesar himself: the tribunician power, the second main source of imperial prerogative. It was this at which Sejanus leaped, and this with which Tiberius struck his line and hooked his fish. But Tiberius did not, after all, appear in person to bestow this final gift on the Tuscan. All this time he was sending message after message to the Senate, or to Sejanus himself, with the most contradictory news. He was well. He was not well. He was never better. He was at death's door. He succeeded in baffling them all as to his real state of mind, or the purport of his actions. The number of people who prudently sat on the fence continually increased. Sejanus was never sufficiently alarmed to retreat, nor sufficiently confident to take some decisive step. Many men began to avoid meeting him or remaining alone in his company. On October 1st, Fulcinius' trio was superseded as consul suffectus by Publius Memmius Regulus, who was not one of the Tuscan's people, and Tiberius remained still in Capri. It was only when Sejanus, as soon as affairs were stirring one morning, went down to the Senate that he met Naevius Sertorius Macro. He knew Macro well, one of his own praetorian officers from Capri, attached to the imperial household. It must have been a distinct surprise to see him. His presence needed at least a word of explanation. Macro was all courtesy and respect. He had a smiling whisper for the ear of Sejanus. He was in Rome to see through the business of the day, the investiture with the tribunician power. The Tuscan understood. The great moment had come. Relieved, delighted, yet scarcely daring to believe in his own success until he saw it, he rushed on winged feet into the Senate. The Senate sat in the Temple of Apollo on the Palatine. All was duly hallowed in. Macro handed a message from Caesar to the consul Regulus and went out again. The consul rose with the message in his hand, and the senators, sitting on tenterhooks of nervous excitement, hardly knew whither to turn their eyes. Was this message about to give the Tuscan his life's achievement? Yes, no doubt. But the alternative was unthinkable. It was not possible for Sejanus to fall now. Tiberius himself would fall if the wrestle came. Regulus unfolded the message of Tiberius. He knew no more than others did what it might possibly contain, and he began to read. It was a lengthy document, written apparently with the fussy circumlocution of an aged man, but in reality with the astute foresight of a crafty diplomatist. After its first words, the more anxious senators began to beam ingratiating smiles upon the haughty Tuscan. Suddenly they started and stopped. A second time they hastened to turn congratulating faces. And a second time the cloud came and the smiles froze. And while that letter is reading, let us look out of the eyes of Macro. 9. The day before, out of the peace and sunshine of Capri, Caesar had quietly summoned Macro, and there Macro stood, facing the grim old man. Tiberius had invested Macro with the office of prefect of the praetorians in succession to Sejanus, and had given him definite instructions, as definite as Sherlock Holmes could have given a deputy, and very nearly as mystifying. What even Macro did not know was that the shattering influence of Caesar penetrated into every nook and cranny. Satrius Secundus, one of the men in the confidence of Sejanus, had hesitated, doubted, and told the secret to Antonia, and Antonia had taken it to Tiberius, and Tiberius knew. Armed with his instructions, Macro set out to hold or to lose the new rank which Caesar had bestowed upon him. He reached Rome at midnight. His first conference was with the consul Regulus. By waiting until Regulus succeeded Fulcinius' trio, Tiberius had made sure that there should be a consul in Rome with power to act and loyalty to obey the commands of Caesar. The instructions were that Regulus should convoke the Senate early in the day at the Temple of Apollo. The earliness of the hour was a specific feature of the instruction. Regulus carried out his orders exactly, not knowing what they might mean. The messages of convocation were dispatched. The next conference was with Graecinus Laco, the chief of the cohortes vigilum. It was arranged with Laco that the approaches of the Temple of Apollo should be occupied by military police. The praetorians were carefully excluded from the plan. This was what had happened the night before. It is unlikely that Macro had slept between the time he visited Regulus soon after midnight and the time he met Sejanus in the morning. When he left the Senate in session, he had no doubt never removed the clothes in which he had ridden from Capri. He could hardly have had time for more than the hastiest toilet. Finally, in the brief interval between the entrance of Sejanus into the Senate and his own entrance to deliver the message, he had executed the last part of his instructions, and the most dangerous. It is typical of the craft and thoroughness of Tiberius that he instructed Macro to test the praetorian escort of Sejanus before delivering the letter. Had they declined to accept Macro, all would have been lost. But in that case, the letter would never have been delivered, and the prestige of Tiberius would have been saved the discredit of a fall. Macro produced his commission and an authority to distribute a gratuity to the guards in recognition of their services. This was a critical moment. All that had gone before and all that was to follow after depended absolutely upon the way in which the praetorians took Macro. But the calculations of Tiberius held good. In the absence of any counteracting force, the name of Caesar retained its spell. The escort accepted Macro without demur. He had thereupon given them the order to return to camp. Then, after seeing that the military police had taken their places, he had entered the temple, delivered the message, walked out again, and with a word to Laco had followed the praetorians. Sejanus was left isolated in the Senate house. 10. The reading of the letter went on, while the praetorians vanished slowly in the distance. By the time they were out of reach and out of earshot, the message of Tiberius, after playing to and fro around the subject, had got to business. It wound up by demanding that action should be taken against Sejanus and his accomplices. Men, Sejanus among them, sat stunned. The consul was taking no chances. He called Sejanus to stand forward. The Tuscan had to arouse himself to realize the situation. He had so lost the habit of receiving commands that he could only inquire in a kind of stupor, "Are you speaking to me?" At length he stood up, and Graecinus Laco, who had entered, went over to take up a position beside him. The consul did not adopt the ordinary procedure of asking the vote of each senator separately, nor did he move a vote of condemnation to death. He moved a resolution of imprisonment, put the question to one senator, and on receiving a vote in favor of the motion, declared it carried. He and the other magistrates led Sejanus out of the house, after which Laco conducted him to prison. The meeting of the Senate hurriedly adjourned, while every senator watched with anxiety for the possible thunderbolt that would fall. None fell. The praetorian camp, with Macro in command, remained closed. Only the populace paraded in force to pull down the statues of Sejanus and to cheer his downfall. When the senators had sufficiently ascertained that there was no immediate probability that the earth would open and swallow them up, they emerged from their houses and reassembled. The adjourned meeting was resumed and proceeded to condemn Sejanus to death. The sentence was instantly carried out. That morning the Tuscan had been to all intents the equal and rival of Caesar. By nightfall his body had been dragged from the Gemonian stairs and was floating down the Tiber. His family was executed with him. The daughter of Sejanus, that proud and ruthless man, was an innocent young girl who protested against being dragged along by strange and brutal men. Anything she had done, she said, would be punished enough by a whipping. She did not know what that world was into which she had suddenly fallen. They paused before the fact that a virgin could not, by Roman law, suffer the capital penalty. But they could take no risks. The difficulty was remedied by the executioner, and the daughter of Sejanus was strangled and thrown out upon the Gemonian stairs. But Nemesis and the Furies were already upon their way. Caesar at Capri had entertained no enthusiastic illusions. He, if anyone, knew how far the whole thing was touch and go. A fleet was waiting to take him to the east if his scheme went wrong. He took his own post on the highest cliff of the island to await the news. When at last it came through by telegraph and he knew that all was well, he returned home, and the ships were dismissed. 11. Some of the Tuscan's partisans turned state evidence. It did not save them, for those whom they involved retaliated. Tiberius referred all charges to the Senate as the supreme criminal court. The charges were serious. Publius Vitellius, a prefect of the Aerarium Militare, the Army Financial Board, was charged with having undertaken to employ the military treasury in support of any action Sejanus might take. Sextus Paconianus was alleged to have been chosen by Sejanus to secure the downfall of Gaius Caesar. At least 3 friends of Tiberius were implicated, but out of 20 persons whose names are found in a first rapid inspection of the record, we find that 1/4 were acquitted. Some of the accused stood their trial and defended themselves with considerable freedom of speech. Others, with the aim of preserving their property for their children, killed themselves without facing a trial. For while the estates of men who were judicially condemned were in all cases confiscated, those of men who voluntarily died were usually spared. The investigations into the proceedings of Sejanus and his accomplices were lengthy and complicated. Many of the accused persons were detained in prison while the evidence was sifted. Tiberius was determined that everything should be dragged to light. He insisted that the Senate should sit regularly and punctually at fixed hours. He laid before it all the information he obtained. The sentences were passed by the Senate. Whatever it may have thought or wished, it had no alternative. It was an ironical commentary upon history that though the brilliant partisan pamphlet of Tacitus survived, this evidence, over which Tiberius took so much trouble, has very imperfectly come down to us. It seems to have been voluminous, and to have existed in documentary form, filed in the imperial archives long after Tiberius's day. Many of the accusations against the character of Tiberius himself, subsequently recorded as facts by historians, are thought to have been derived from these very indictments which Tiberius himself published. But he had not done with the Tuscan yet. 12. The events which attended the fall of Sejanus had been harassing enough to try to the utmost the nerve of a man of 72. The danger, the difficulty, the intellectual exertion, the nervous strain, the tension of those moments when all hung in the balance, the unremitting work and constant concentration, all these must have driven even a robust man to the verge of exhaustion. And now, on the top of this, fell a fresh thunderbolt. News so terrible that the worst he had surmised of Sejanus seemed a trifle by comparison. For the revenge of Sejanus was singularly complete and successful. His divorced wife, Epicata, whom he had put away in order to be free to marry Livilla, must have felt that intoxicated devotion which he seemed able to produce in any woman at will. She had held his secrets, even the secrets which Livilla shared with him. She avenged him now, and herself also. She wrote a letter to Tiberius, and then killed herself. The letter was duly delivered to Caesar. By this letter of Epicata, the truth stood revealed. Full details were given, details confirmed when the testimony of the slaves concerned was taken. 13. Drusus, the son of Tiberius, had not died a natural death. He had been poisoned by Sejanus and Livilla. End of Chapter 11. Read by Mark Harrington, Framingham, Massachusetts. Chapter 12 of Tiberius Caesar by George Philip Baker. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 12. The Old Man of Capri. 1. No one ever recorded how Tiberius took it, what hot and cold fits shook him, what stunning of mind and blenching of spirit made him still and silent. No one tells us of any sleepless nights under the gnawing rage of humiliation and pain, nor of the old man pacing his bedchamber full of awful thoughts and dreadful self-doubt. If he felt no such emotions, then he was unlike any other man, for the essence of all was that he had been fooled indeed to the end of his bent. He knew more than we know. He could look back, where we cannot follow him, and perceive precisely how far he had been deluded, trapped into views and actions which we can only guess at now. And this by a man over whom he had extended the patronizing faith of a master towards a servant, a man whom, at root, he despised. There are some experiences of bitterness which spread so wide and sink so deep into a man's being that the whole structure of it is poisoned and changed and seems to be loosened from its roots in human society. There is no bitterness so bitter as that which springs from the experience of treachery. Man is so made that it is a spiritual torment to him to know that his friend has taken his confidence and used it against him, has accepted his heart and thrown it away. This is multiplied many times when not one man only, but all men are the traitors. There is no more destructive thing in life than to see all men smiling and to know that every smile is false, to take every man's hand and to know that it is a right hand of falsehood. But like physical pain, spiritual pain is normally subject to a law of diminishing returns. The last increments no longer give pain at all. They merely poison and paralyze, and what at first was a suffering becomes transformed into a change of nature. A man learns to accept his isolation, his dreadful separation from the heartening and nourishing fountain of human love and careless trust. He acquires the art of standing alone, enclosed in a shell of individualism. And he learns to watch, to guard, to trace with acute observation the course of the hidden treason, to diagnose it with expert eyes, as a physician diagnoses the symptoms, invisible to any ordinary eye, of some malady, to strike at the appropriate moment without ruth or remorse. But to do this involves the loss of all the typically human qualities and happiness. A man so placed and so changed seems no longer human as we understand the word. He has become daimonic. He seems possessed of a spirit other than the human. And he is. Weak men die. perhaps of broken hearts, as we call them, or take to drink, and we find them in obscure taverns, full of a long story of their troubles, in the wild hope of finding someone yet who will understand and will bring them, however casually, the balm of good-humored sympathy and a shadowy affection. But strong men stand fast and become possessed of the demon. So did Tiberius. If we look at his portrait as an old man, we see in it the full story. It is lined deep with that dyspepsia which comes of suffering. Children know that moment when they have wept themselves into a mood in which food will not nourish nor drink satisfy. With Tiberius, they were inward, spiritual tears, shed invisibly and without hope. He had brushed them away and dried them, and had regarded the world again with a determination to hold his ground. It is an impenetrable, inaccessible eye which perceives but does not tell us what it perceives, a mouth that almost smiles with the scornful content of knowledge. 2. The revelation which followed the death of Sejanus seemed to possess Tiberius with this demonic quality. It is always dangerous to challenge a man to do his worst. It is so easy for him to do it. It seemed as if all men and all things had conspired together to crush the Lord of the world, and the Lord of the world set his back to the wall and struck back at all men and all things. It was a quaint logic which made them each other's tyrants and victims. There must have been something wrong about it. No one really knows the fate of Livilla. Some say she was executed, some that she killed herself, some that she was handed over to Antonia, who was given the commission of seeing that Livilla removed herself adequately from the scene. Tiberius was determined to bring to light the whole story. But it was no longer the old Tiberius who did so. It was a new and terrifying man, owning indeed the outlines of Tiberius, but inhabited by a spirit of remorseless and embittered energy. The truth was torn out. For whole days on end, he was absorbed in the task of investigation. So completely was he obsessed by it that the grim joke was passed round that when one of his old friends from Rhodes arrived, cordially invited by Caesar to visit him at Rome, Tiberius had forgotten all about the invitation and ordered him to be put to the question forthwith, under the impression that he was another witness whose testimony was to be examined. Many stories of his state of mind at this time have been preserved. When a certain Carnulus died, Tiberius remarked, "Carnulus has managed to dodge me." To one who begged for a speedy death, he responded, "I have not yet become your friend." This was not a Tiberius whom anyone had heard of before. He showed no sign of failing powers or of intellectual decay. He was never more active nor more energetic, but it was a strange and demonic energy that seemed to be superimposed upon his normal powers. He had enough wisdom to put an immediate stop to an information lodged by a soldier and to lay down the rule that no man connected with the army was to turn delator. All the documents went to the Senate. Even denunciations of his character and charges against him were published. He did not care what was published. All he was concerned with was that everything should come out. Fulcinius Trio, who, though he had hitherto escaped, had a guilty conscience, grew so alarmed at the possibilities that he killed himself. His heirs found his will to contain a wrathful denunciation of Tiberius, who was described as, quote, "a senile old man," unquote. They tried to suppress the incriminating docket, but the senile old man ordered it to be read aloud, denunciation and all. No one could understand his motives, and he did not trouble to explain them. 3. The death sentences which the Senate passed fell, however, upon mere agents. The principals, Sejanus and Livilla, had already gone. Tiberius sought for some other satisfaction, and he found it in observing the case of Agrippina and her son Drusus. Tiberius was already aware that Sejanus had been deliberately planning to involve and destroy Agrippina and her sons. He knew now what the whole truth was, but although the truth stood revealed, it could not, merely by being revealed, be remedied. Tiberius had no power to extricate himself from the vicious circle. He could not at this stage apologize to Agrippina and Drusus and put them back where they had been. He could not at any stage have done so. The skill of the Tuscan had been shown in the way in which he induced Agrippina and her sons to give him a complete and irrefutable justification for his action against them. It was this possibility of wiping the children of Julia with unimpeachable justice out of the succession to the empire which had led him to contemplate the removal of Tiberius' son Drusus. It was not unreasonably far-fetched to look upon Agrippina as the original cause of the whole series of events. Those who had egged her on were still more guilty, but they were not directly accessible. Tiberius could not cancel or eradicate the hate which the children of Julia bore him. That Sejanus had used it for his own purposes made no difference. One thing he could do, however, he could drag it to the light. He wished the world to see the unreasoning, implacable hatred working in the minds of Julia's children, that set, persistent obsession that he had hounded them and persecuted them, though he had only defended himself against that very conviction on their part. And it is possible that the mere similarity of names riveted the morbid interest of Tiberius. One Drusus paid for the other Drusus. There might be some queer, involved satisfaction in such a theme, for when men are pressed beyond their endurance, they find relief in strange forms. Superficial likenesses, casual associations of ideas fill the place of real resemblances and unattainable identities. The Senate was filled with alarm and consternation when Tiberius reported to it in full detail, with a kind of grim satisfaction, the death of Drusus, the son of Germanicus and Agrippina. Drusus had weakened. It lasted 9 days, during which he had gnawed the stuffing of his mattress. Tiberius scornfully called him a weakling as well as a traitor. He produced a carefully posted diary compiled by the jailers who had watched Drusus die. As if it were some novel of Zola, it described minutely and elaborately the stages by which Drusus had starved to death in his prison. His first fury and terror, how he had abused Tiberius in detail, with, no doubt, all the stock accusations of the friends of Julia, and how they had replied to him and beaten him back when he strove to tear down the bars of his cell. And then how, giving up hope, he had elaborately and with care called down imprecations on the head of Tiberius, praying that, since he had murdered his daughter-in-law, Livilla, his brother's son, Germanicus, and his own grandchildren, the sons of Agrippina, and had deluged his own house with blood, so he might pay the penalty to his name and race in the eyes of posterity. The Senate broke up in disorder, horrified at this story. The old man may have invented it, but he certainly claimed the credit of the crime, and it is not for us to reject his claim. And it had its practical utilities. It underlined, for the benefit of the Senate, the fact that Caesar was ready to outbid any man, that he would give measure for measure and blow for blow, and that there was nothing he would not cap, and no stake he would not double. Moreover, it disposed of all pretenders and false claimants. The Senate certainly became clearly aware that Drusus was dead. Agrippina was of stronger nerve. Unconquerable to the last, she retorted by refusing food and starving herself to death as a demonstration that Tiberius could not frighten her. But there was no real satisfaction in all these things. Vengeance is a drug which, like all drugs, will give no permanent rest or satiety. It is a tantalus fruit which can never be grasped or achieved. It excites the appetite which it pretends to allay. Tiberius grew weary. He was intelligent enough to recognize these truths, even though he could not place them in the moral scheme. A certain time after the fall of Sejanus, he found the memory intolerable, and even revenge a fatigue without pleasure. He briefly ordered the execution of all who were detained in prison in connection with the conspiracy of Sejanus. They apparently numbered 20 persons. 4. He had lost everything. Nothing remained to him but victory. And victory was a trifle in comparison with the things he had lost in achieving it. 5. From this height of crisis, matters began to subside slowly towards the normal. The blow which he had leveled at his foes was followed by a measure which may not have been unconnected with it. Among the legislation of Gaius Julius was a law directed towards restraining the activities of those financial powers which had swayed the political destinies of the old republic. The amount of floating capital which they might hold was limited by the regulation that a certain proportion of their property should always be invested in Italian land. By this means he had prevented the existence of those vast funds of money and of easily negotiable credit which had financed one political revolution after another, and of which he himself had been glad enough to take advantage. Caesar the dictator had meant himself to be the last man who should overthrow a government by such means. In view of the activities of the senatorial party during the reign of Tiberius, we need not be surprised to hear that this law had been very loosely observed. The position which Tiberius had hitherto occupied had been far too precarious to allow strong measures in enforcement of the law. He could not safely have risked the consequences. But the situation was rapidly changing. After the fall of Sejanus and the death of Agrippina, the terrible old man of Capri was no longer the figure of fun which had patiently borne the insults of the Senate and had been hoodwinked by the Tuscan. The delators were set to work. The first legal informations which they lodged against breakers of the law of Julius were soon fluttering the dovecotes. The cases were carried to the Senate. But the senators were alive to the possible consequences. Many of them would figure in the dock if the informations were systematically laid. And besides, to enforce the law would bring about a financial crisis. They referred the matter to the imperial court and left Tiberius to solve the problem himself. He was quite willing to do so, and he had his plan prepared. It did not meet with universal approval, even among his friends. His constant adviser, Marcus Cocceius Nerva, seems to have been strongly opposed to it. It was nevertheless authorized. Tiberius informed the Senate that the law must be enforced, but that 18 months' grace would be allowed, during which all accounts might be regularized. The sympathies of Nerva were with the Republican oligarchy. He did not really care for the atmosphere of the imperial court, though he had served it with perfect loyalty for many years. He, too, perhaps, was worn out and weary with the strain of those years of moral earthquake and eclipse, a weariness that went beyond mere resignation and retirement. He resolved to die. Tiberius was much concerned. He came and sat by Nerva's bed and reasoned with him, pointing out how much he himself would feel it and how much it would damage his reputation in the world's eyes if his chosen counselor took this way of expressing dissent from his financial policy. But Nerva was not to be diverted from his resolution. He declined all food and died. The financial crisis duly arrived. The process of rearrangement necessitated by the enforcement of the law involved the calling in of loans. Debtors had to sell their estates in order to meet their liabilities. The value of land fell so that many were ruined. Tiberius advanced 100 million sesterces to the Senate as a loan fund, out of which it could make advances without interest to all debtors who could give suitable security. The plan seems, as far as we can trace it, to have been successful, and the financial situation was reformed into accordance with the law without further disaster. The struggle against Tiberius was now practically at an end. The masked war, which for nearly 20 years had been carried on against him, was nearing its finish by the gradual arrest of his principal senatorial opponents, and its conclusion was finally ratified by this administrative step which suppressed the accumulation of free capital by which such a war could be financed. But when we mark the degree to which the later decline of the Roman world was brought about by economic weakness, and when we consider how far economic prosperity is produced by plenitude of free capital, we may wonder whether it was not in these days that the damage was first done. For it is clear that a certain rigidity began to appear in the economic condition of the empire. Wealth and productivity no longer expanded with the old vitality. And when, in due time, the stress came, Roman civilization had insufficient resources with which to meet it. 6. The trouble for Tiberius was the extent of his success. It seemed difficult to restrain senators from wallowing in a desperate and even an inconvenient humility. They could not sufficiently mark their appreciation of the superhuman virtues of Caesar or of their own unworthiness. The dawn of a slow smile can be detected in the old man, a smile which, perhaps, betokened, in a reawakening sense of humor, a return to sanity. The tributes which had been cast at his feet were peculiar. Togonius Gallus proposed that the senators should themselves form a bodyguard to defend their beloved friend and protector when he honored them with his presence, a stroke of humor which cracked the hard shell of the old man's embittered gravity. He discussed the matter with elaborate care, finally deciding that the plan was too comic to be put into operation. It might have led, moreover, to some regrettable accident. Junius Gallio suggested that all Praetorian veterans should be created ex officio equites. Tiberius replied by having him turned out of the Senate, remarking that here, evidently, was another Sejanus, trying to tamper with the guardsmen. Amid all this, one man's voice had been raised in clear tones. Marcus Terentius, accused of being a friend of Sejanus, defended himself as a man should. He spoke the simple words of common sense, which, in such circumstances, ring out almost as brilliant paradox. Yes, he said in effect, I was a friend of Sejanus, and so were you, and so was Caesar. Who was I to investigate the virtues of Caesar's minister? I crawled, as you all did. It was fame, then, to be known to the hall porter of Sejanus, or to his servants. Let plots be punished, and conspiracies suppressed. But as for friendship with Sejanus, the same argument must clear you, me, and Caesar himself. Tiberius seems to have liked this, for he made it a case in which, quote, the dog it was that died, end quote. The accusers of Terentius received appropriate penalties. Terentius himself went home a free man. But Tiberius retired still further into remoteness. In this shifting sand of treachery, only one thing remained true: the loyalty of the Praetorian Guard. While the educated, the wealthy, and the distinguished could no longer be trusted, the more elementary instincts of humanity still ran true to type. Uneducated, undistinguished men of the poorer classes still earned their wages, respected the hand that fed them, and obeyed the rules. And they preserved this sense of duty and service towards a hard man who had never flattered them nor cajoled them. Their reward was not yet, but in due time it came. 7. Then a silence falls upon Capri. But far away, at the other end of the Roman world, events were moving. What happened in Palestine seemed but a tiny spark compared with the gloom and blaze of the deeds done in Rome, as if during a volcanic eruption someone had lit a candle. But at 1900 years' distance, the volcano has died to a gleam and a column of smoke, and the candle has grown to a vast light like morning. The obscure Jewish prophet Joshua, whose co-religionists Tiberius had expelled from Rome, began his career in the year of Agrippina's arrest, the year before the fall of Sejanus. And this year, in which Drusus and Agrippina died, he came up to Jerusalem preaching his remarkable doctrine of the kingdom of God, with its even more remarkable rules. Quote, "Love your enemies, bless them that curse you, do good to them that hate you, and pray for them that despitefully use you and persecute you." End quote. And, quote, "Take no thought, saying, what shall we eat? Or what shall we drink? Or wherewith shall we be clothed? But seek first the kingdom of God and his justice, and all these things shall be added." End quote. And the crowd followed the candle. The procurator, who by tradition was Pontius Pilatus, received a deputation of the priests and elders, bringing this man with them. They wished him to be dealt with according to Roman law. Pontius, unconscious that his house had been invaded by the actors in the world's greatest drama, and that he had been roped in to play an impromptu part, pooh-poohed this proposal. What had a Roman procurator to do with the sectarian squabbles of the Jews? They insisted because this man had preached sedition, a kingdom that was not Caesar's dominion. Pontius, living in days when Drusus and Agrippina were dying in their prisons, and when the delators were on the watch for evidence of majestas, may well have rubbed his chin. That allegation, no doubt, altered the question. He accordingly interviewed the stranger. Did he claim to be a king? "Not of this world," answered Joshua. "Some kind of king, then?" suggested Pontius. "The word is yours, not mine," said Joshua, and he added, "I was born to testify to the truth. Those who know the truth know what I am." It was then that Pontius unawares took on a sort of immortality by his famous question, "What is truth?" He got no answer, for truth cannot be defined in words. Pontius was puzzled. Evidently there was no sedition about this Jew, and he said as much. But the charge that the priests insisted on making against Joshua was that he made himself out to be equal to God, and they declined to hear of his release. Pontius, disturbed, went back to interview Joshua afresh. What was his origin? But Joshua would not say. He left it to Pontius to judge. Pontius reminded him that he, as procurator, had power to condemn or acquit. Joshua's answer was, Your power is from above. You are not responsible save to the source from which you derive it. Pontius appreciated this perfectly and had no doubt as to what he ought to do. But then the priests would not let him do it. They insisted that anyone who made himself out to be a king spoke against Caesar. So they had their way. That story is well known. The career of Joshua, his betrayal and his death, and his resurrection and glorification as the founder of the religious society which grew and fought its way through opposition and rivalry until it equaled and then exceeded the empire and extended its power over lands which had never known the laws of the Republic or the legions of Caesar. Not quite so well recognized are the parallels between the two stories, which were being enacted simultaneously in the West and the East. Within the same 3 or 4 years, both reached their crisis and determined the subsequent history of the world. 8. Sejanus and Judas Iscariot walked in the same world. The southeasterly wind may have blown to Sejanus in Rome the air that Judas had breathed. When we turn from one story to the other, they illuminate one another to a high degree. The story of Tiberius was determined by principles which belonged to a moral world rapidly becoming obsolete. He acted and thought still as a man trained to a narrow and local community. He could not deal with the vast tides which ebbed and flowed around the chair of Caesar. But the story of Joshua the Galilean was governed by principles belonging to a new world, which was just about to issue its appeal to mankind, and to rise to power on the response men made to it, principles which were adapted to a universal application. For the master of Judas knew secrets, wielded a nature, and dealt with an experience beyond the range of the master of Sejanus. Furthermore, his ultimate object and his immediate duty were also different. About Judas himself we are left in an enigmatical silence. No express forgiveness was ever offered Judas. His crime, too, was of an awful and fundamental nature, but it was permitted to be successful. It was not contested by any such deep counterplot as that which circumvented and overthrew Sejanus. It was never visited by any hurricane of vengeance. It left behind it no such corroding poison as that which ate into the heart and destroyed the soul of Tiberius. The Galilean showed no sign of spiritual injury. He met, checked, transmuted, and annihilated that poison, as a physician might administer to himself the antidote to a snakebite. And he went to his death, not without some ominous occasional silence and some disquieting warning to others, but, in effect, still cordial, still confident in his firm attachment to the world of grace and loyalty and vivid life. He had communication with that world by another way. His resources were not exhausted by the failure of humanity. He was not distorted by other men's evil. He knew the means by which to neutralize its effect upon the world and its results upon himself. But these things were beyond the horizon of Tiberius. 9. Sunset. Little remained save to look over the calm sea of Capri and to decide leisurely about the future. Tiberius had no enthusiasm on that score. He had seen the family dissolve round about him. The wreck that remained was not such as to inspire any man with hope, and he had none. "The sky can fall when I am gone," he once remarked. But habit and temperament held him from maintaining this mood. He almost automatically fidgeted with the pieces of wreckage and began to place them in speculative order. His nephew, Claudius, he seems to have rejected as out of the reckoning. Claudius was half-witted. That misjudgment of character which Augustus had displayed about Tiberius, Tiberius showed towards Claudius. The latter was destined to sit in the seat of the Caesars, and to be by no means the worst or weakest of his house. Yet the misjudgment was not altogether complete. Augustus had been partly right, and so was Tiberius. There was his grandson Gemellus, the son of Drusus. Perhaps Tiberius would have preferred him. He was neither strong nor clever, and moreover his birth was suspect in his grandfather's eyes. He belonged to that hateful and horrible time when Sejanus was paying court to Livilla. It was a very moot point whether it were worthwhile to place him in a position which he might not be able to maintain. On the other hand, it might be even more imprudent to place him where his competitors had him at their mercy. Tiberius ended by deciding to give Gemellus a run for his money. Let the boy sink or swim as he could. The strong probability was that he would sink. That could be left to prove itself. Gaius remained as the likeliest candidate. He was the sole surviving son of Germanicus, and the attitude which Tiberius adopted towards him is in some ways a decisive test of the old man's real motives and past actions. Had the enemies of Tiberius been wholly right, he would have sent Gaius with some promptitude to join his mother and his brothers. Far from doing this, he showed once more the impartiality which had always marked his views and conduct. He did not like Gaius. If the boy were the survival of the fittest, it was as the fittest to survive in an atmosphere of doubt and suspicion in which nothing sincere could live. With the cunning of some primitive organism, he had taken on a protective coloration and had burrowed into the soil. The old man's terrible eye, straying to and fro, could still see nothing to fear from Gaius. There the little reptile was, obediently burrowing. It was a very queer result of the struggle for survival that the survivor should be this. Yet so it turned out, and no argument could more perfectly prove that it is the nature of the competition which determines the value of the victory. So Gaius was to be the fruit of all that had been done. It was exceedingly strange. Tiberius made his will. He was 76 years old. Gaius and Gemellus were to be his joint heirs. Rome, obsessed with a purely romantic notion that Germanicus had belonged to the Golden Age and that a son of his would bring it back again, was glad. These are the embittering fantasies of mankind. What virtues had Germanicus ever really shown? That passion for the decorative which fills the heart of mankind perhaps sincerely prefers the aspect to the substance, the show to the reality. It would always rather have its gold, fairy gold. While the philosopher will see no reason for quarreling with this choice, the moralist occasionally finds some ground for doing so. 10. Macro saw how the tide set in this evening light. The will of Tiberius meant practically that Gaius would be his successor, for Gemellus would not count for much. Macro was prompt to take Gaius in hand. His wife saw to it that Gaius should be kept amused, all of which the old man fully appreciated. "You leave the setting to court the rising sun," he said. He jibed, but it made no difference to Macro. Whatsoever adventures Tiberius might meet with in his personal life, he was little changed in his character as a ruler. It may be that, as with many another man, his personal life, his hopes, fears, ambitions, and affections, his sufferings, his triumphs, were much less his own than that official life of business and administration in which he was truly himself. The former, at least, had a quality of doubtfulness and instability about it. It changed, varied, crept, and paused. That is in striking contrast with the well-ballasted, even run of his personality as a statesman. He had steadily declined the title of Father of his country. He remained without doubt its watchful guardian, always ready to dip his hand into his pocket to meet emergencies. The year after he had made his will, a great fire broke out on the Aventine in Rome and did great damage in the poorer quarters. The old man, who had waded unhesitatingly through the blood of his political foes in the interests of the imperial power, came to the rescue of the sufferers. Out of his careful and economical exchequer, he produced another 100 million sesterces. Strangely enough, as time narrowed, and it became ever clearer that the days of Tiberius could not have very long to run, there were those who faced without pleasure the prospect of his departure. It was Lucius Arruntius who expressed the apprehensions which the wiser men entertained. Arruntius was one of the defendants in a case in which Albusilla, the wife of Satrius Secundus, the delator, was concerned. The Senate regarded the case as unsatisfactory. The documents which came before it were not endorsed by Tiberius, and the Senate doubted whether they were in order. It was believed that Macro might have put them through without proper authorization. Arruntius wearied of these things and made up his mind to free himself from the trouble they involved. Before making his exit from the scene, he made a speech to his friends. He expressed his sense of the hopelessness of the future. There was little to which they could look forward with any expectation of improvement. He spoke, of course, from his own point of view. Tiberius, he thought, had been demoralized by the possession of supreme power and had degenerated from his natural character into that of a tyrant. This also, of course, was his own point of view. Tiberius might have seen things from a somewhat different angle, but Arruntius was on surer ground when he pointed out that a moral strain which had warped Tiberius would not be without effect on Gaius. He preferred not to suffer the days coming when a worse and weaker man sat in the chair of Caesar. To which, of course, Tiberius might have replied that they should have thought of that before. Arruntius was not far wrong, and his words formed, in some respects, the verdict of the wiser men in the Senate on the rule of Tiberius. They had elected to go further, and they were going to fare worse. 11. Tiberius was certainly failing in health. He had always been a vigorous man who had never needed a doctor, and even the gradual physical weakness which began to creep upon him could not master the mental energy which had been the main source of his strength. But he needed now to force his energies. Early in the year A.D. 37, he set out on his travels, driven by that spirit which sends the dying beast forth to prospect for the heavenly home from which it has dreamt it came. He journeyed slowly along the Via Appia towards Rome. That, to all appearance, must be the place. But the auspices told a different tale. Driven back by adverse omens, he turned away from the distant prospect of the towers and domes of the eternal city, turned away forever from it and all that it implied. He had reigned there. He, the man Tiberius Claudius Nero, had dwelt there as supreme governor of the Roman world, very nearly the governor of all known mankind. And now he was setting his face in another direction. He was never to see it again. If men are immortal, and the soul of Tiberius still lives, perhaps on his journey his face is still turned away from Rome. He went down to Campania again. At Astura he had fallen ill, but recovered somewhat, and continued his journey to Circe. He insisted on attending a military review, which, though he concealed the fact, left him exhausted afterwards. He went on to Misenum. His strength was slowly sinking. It was ebbing steadily, naturally, by degrees. He preserved his austere dignity to the last. He did not admit his weakness. He held up an unconquered, disagreeable face. If his head were bloody, though not so much so as his hands, it was certainly unbowed. At the villa of Lucullus at Misenum, he paused in order to rest. It was to be a longer rest than he chose to admit. He had no regular physician. From time to time he accepted advice from Charicles, the most famous physician of his day. It was probably not altogether a coincidence that Charicles was present at Misenum, but Tiberius would not be doctored. The information which could not be obtained by direct means, Charicles obtained by stratagem. On leaving Caesar, the physician respectfully took his hand and was able to judge his pulse. The old man was too keen to be hoodwinked. Recognizing the trick, he ordered another course to be served and sat at table longer than was his usual custom. Charicles, however, had learned all he needed. He informed Macro that the old man was sinking and could not last more than 2 days. Hurried consultations were instantly held. The armies were at once notified of the impending event. In the villa of Lucullus, Tiberius slowly sank. He may have thought of that gallant and adventurous gentleman of the old Republican time, whose millions and whose profusion were still a wonder-tale for the imaginative credulity of sightseers. Lucullus had been an artist in the pyrotechnics of luxury. And what an artist! What fireworks he had made of it! Amid those rooms and corridors, Tiberius may have taken his last feeble, austere meals, reflecting over the simple mind which can really enjoy these childlike things. A great happy baby, this Lucullus. Well, it was over 77 years since Livia, in the consulship of Plancus, and the year of the battle of Philippi, bore the child Tiberius Claudius Nero in that little house on the Palatine Hill. 76 since she carried him in her arms in wild flight from their foes in the dark days of civil war, when the daughter of Pompeius Magnus had given him that little cloak which was still carefully preserved in Capri. And one event at last confounds the weak, the strong, the loved, the hated, the good, the bad, the wise man, and the fool. So there, where Lucullus had walked and talked, amid the splendid gardens, Tiberius died. The whispers would not let him alone even then. It ran like wildfire that Macro, seeing the old stalwart survive, had smothered him with the bedclothes, but the cold smile of Tiberius Caesar could not be broken now. End of Chapter 12. Read by Mark Harrington, Framingham, Massachusetts. Chapter 13 of Tiberius Caesar by George Philip Baker. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 13. The Legacy of Tiberius. 1. The world of Rome, rejoicing to be free from the Old Man of Capri, hardly noticed the legacy he left to succeeding ages. It scarcely knew what he had portended, or what he remitted to them. Part of it was his deliberate deed, but part of it was what men call accident and fatality and destiny. Part was scattered episode of isolated wreck. part a tangled and involved chain of the logic of events, terribly connected and continuous, coherent with an awe-inspiring coherence, arresting because there is meaning in it, but not a meaning that was ever created by, or due to, or enshrined in a human mind. We see this non-human rationality, and we recoil from it because we fear to behold a reason and a system that, alike in the worst things in the world and in the best, is born of no human ancestry. But it was there, and from a safe distance we may inspect it and debate its nature. 2. The product of that tremendous war between the old man and his foes was the principate of Gaius Caesar, the queer, rickety, abnormal, baby-faced son of Germanicus and Agrippina. The world went into holiday to welcome him as if he had been an angel of heaven. But Gaius had another name. He was called Caligula. And Caligula shot his bolt in a meteoric career of crime and incredible fatuity, and fell to the sword of Cassius Carraya. Then they pulled Claudius, the brother of Germanicus, to light, and he stepped upon the stage with his voluminous history and his reformed spelling, and his wife Messalina, whose name is a proverb, and his freedmen Pallas and Narcissus, who ruled the world for Claudius and made themselves the richest men on earth. And then, unable to find anyone else, they made way for Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, whom men remember as Nero, the son of Agrippina the Younger. These were the rulers who were the nemesis of Rome. These were the men she suffered because of the deeds she had done to Tiberius. And as one of their contemporaries said, men gnawed their tongues for pain, but repented not of the evil. They did not know what they had done, so they could not repent of it. There was logic in this. 2 results sprang from it. The failure of Augustus to found a hereditary monarchy opened upon the world all the difficulties and dangers of government by a military guild with an elective head. That in which Augustus had failed was never successfully achieved by any of his successors, and the oligarchy was compelled in the end to make a compromise with a force it had thus doomed to remain a perpetual danger. Rome hovered between 2 political principles, neither of which she could completely accept. She could neither retain her hold upon the principle of the elective magistrate, nor seize the principle of the hereditary succession which might have controlled the military guild. Having fought with so deep and intense a bitterness to establish one or the other, she had, as a consequence, neither, and she bore the brunt of that disaster. The power of the Principate was strengthened rather than weakened. The very fact that its headship remained elective ensured, on the whole, that there should be none of those minorities, or those long periods of government by incapable princes, which, under hereditary monarchy, are the opportunities for weakening its power. By seeking to destroy the empire, the senatorial oligarchy had riveted it around their own necks in its most oppressive and enduring form. 3. The opposition to the empire, prolonged for generations by the senatorial order, began, after its defeat at the hands of Tiberius, to drift away from its old standpoints. In its new form, it found its most coherent expression in the Stoic party. Its association with a philosophical rather than a strictly political theory marked a gradual change in its purpose. Stoicism became the last refuge of the old Roman spirit. The ancient gravitas, the ancient equality, found their best expression in Stoicism because Stoicism very happily provided a platform on which they might be displayed without the embarrassment of other old Roman virtues. To be stern, severe, and opposed to tyranny became a luxury which could be indulged in without the awkward necessity of producing practical results. The Stoics neither conquered worlds, it was fortunately unnecessary, nor did they demonstrate in any other way the art of government which the old Roman spirit had shown. They did not demonstrate anything except their own virtue. But in an age and among a class of men in which even the merely decorative virtues were growing rare, these virtues made their possessors the heads and representatives of their class. Even to strike a Catonic pose was wonderful in the eyes of men who had forgotten how to achieve even that much of the Catonic. The decadence of a class is always shown in the disappearance of its ability to produce practical results. The power to move men, the power to create, was passing utterly away from the Roman oligarchy. It could not conceive what it wanted. It could not put before itself a definite aim or purpose. It could not stand with men in the marketplace and tell them what concrete human good it proposed to bestow upon them. It had nothing to give them. The most ragged Christian could promise the kingdom of God and eternal life. The lords of the world could promise nothing. They did not know what men wanted because they did not know what they themselves wanted. There are certain well-worn military maxims which are almost moral proverbs. Attack is the best defense is a principle which holds good in more spheres than that of war. The economic rulers of the Roman world never grasped it. They failed because they organized for safety, for leisure, and for comfort, and they left no margin for the catastrophes which wait upon human life. A continuous expansion, a continuous vital activity exploring every possible opportunity for change and improvement is the only condition under which men may safely count upon holding their own. And such things depend upon the ideal which is continually held up before men by the religion in which they believe. Fetish worshippers have a habit of waiting for something to happen by magic. But Stoicism was itself a negative doctrine, a theory of endurance rather than a theory of action. Its effect was to make men impervious to evil, not to make them powerful for good. And yet suffering is the price men pay for power. No creed evolved from the philosophical, the intellectual basis could give them the power of action. Stoicism could not do so, and therefore it did not succeed in restoring to power the republican principle in politics. 4. But had the Stoics absolutely no gift of a political sort to give mankind? There is one indirect gift which perhaps they did succeed in giving, and they gave it in peculiar circumstances, not without an instructive side to the onlooker. The very fact that the Republican opposition took the shape of an ethical theory rather than that of an alternative policy subjected the empire to a moral criticism more useful than any political criticism could have been. A military guild such as the Imperial Roman Army, in which ability is the sole road to success, is liable to develop characteristics of an alarming nature. We can see the fatal fault that resulted from its headship remaining elective, the atmosphere of internal competition which issued in continual intrigue and conspiracy. As long as the last of the aristocratic houses endured, they managed to stave off the worst of the effects by monopolizing the higher commands. But even under Augustus and Tiberius, there were signs that this barrier might not last long. The men from below were already knocking at the door. They brought with them an atmosphere of fierce, deadly, unrelenting, unremitting competition, in which every man's hand was against his neighbor, and every weapon was legitimate in the strife. The prize was the supremacy that placed the whole world in their hands. Men like Sejanus and Macro were a new type. The master of the Roman world thus needed not only to struggle with his external foes and with the external opposition which questioned his title, but to hold his position against his own friends. Never for one moment could such a man as Tiberius sleep or take his disport or lean his weight on any loyalty or any love. His watch must be more terrible than that of any wise virgin, a perpetual, wakeful, unvarying distrust. He could never forget himself or others. And this watchfulness, inhuman and abnormal, for in every normal man's life there must be whole realms he never need doubt, and many hours in which he can freely forget that he possesses a back to be stabbed in, could only end in the spiritual destruction of the men subjected to it. The wonder is that they were so good. It was long after the days of Tiberius that this evil rose to its greatest magnitude, but he was the man who felt the first force of the tide. To a less degree, the evil ran a considerable way back into the main body of the army, ceasing only when it reached the rank and file. Men who were trained for 25 years of their lives as no other men to trust their backs to their friends in the hour of danger. There cannot have been an officer of any considerable rank who did not, in his place and to his degree, share the watch of Caesar. Against this, at any rate, as against the cowardly disunion in their own party, the Stoics set an adamantine face. In such a world of mutual suspicion and mutual competition, there was something great in the man who briefly held the doctrine that external circumstances were of no importance. He declined to watch or to struggle. He took only moderate and reasonable precautions. He went to death with indifference. The existence of the Stoic was a silent comment on the moral tension of Caesar's palace. It did not ultimately fail of its effect. When Nero had at last fallen, and Galba, Otho, and Vitellius had followed him in the struggle which took place over his body, Vespasian, the survivor, represented a distinct movement towards the senatorial position. Slowly, a compromise began to work itself out. After Titus had veered towards the Senate and Domitian had backed away from it, the foundation was laid in the person of Nerva for an accommodation which gave the empire 4 great rulers in succession of a very noteworthy type. They represented a new orientation towards the Stoic, culminating in Marcus Annius Verus, the emperor Marcus Aurelius, whose stoicism is too obvious to need mention. But this moral victory of Stoicism was won only at the moment when it ceased to have any connection with oligarchic politics of the old sort. Stoicism had no real connection with any political theory. It could be as heartily entertained by an absolute monarch as by the most confirmed republican. But when all had been said and done, it formed the bridge by which some of the earlier Roman virtues had been carried over to a new era. Robbed of its philosophy, the oligarchy continued to become less and less of a political power. It diminished, became misty, and its republican principles dissolved into the intangible atmosphere which never left Rome. 5. The compromise between the Senate and the Empire, which was established by Nerva, gave the Roman world 84 years of peace and prosperity. It was broken up under Commodus, and thenceforward the contest was renewed on fresh ground. The real weakness of the senatorial party disclosed itself by degrees. While it represented the elements of civil and economic life, its members were unable to maintain the world in economic prosperity. They could not organize the production of wealth. Power was torn from them by fierce and hasty soldiers. The struggle terminated in the accession of the Illyrian emperors and the political reorganization of the state as an absolute monarchy in which the Senate was practically abolished. But the military power could not maintain itself when the economic foundation was crumbling beneath its feet. The effort only hastened the end. There came a time when Roman armies were fighting the barbarians of the north upon no more than level terms. In Western Europe, the great military guild at last sank and vanished in the slough of economic collapse. It was only in the last period of this struggle that the state resorted for help to the new religion, which was the expression of its unity and universality. The possible results which might have followed from the quick perception and early adoption of the principles of that religion are illustrated by the wonderful reformation and restoration which they brought about in the eastern provinces, where the empire was given another 1,000 years of useful life. To the west they came too late. Men, not being entirely wise nor completely free, are able to see and to act only when the force of circumstances lends its driving power. History is the tale of the blindness and the blunders of mankind, far more than, as Edward Gibbon thought, of its crimes and catastrophes. Christianity was the survivor of a struggle which included a number of competitors. The old Roman religion, the system we roughly indicate by the general term paganism, the old system of local cults and primitive customs, roughly and imperfectly universalized by a process of identifying the principal figures in its various mythologies, and veneered over with Greek philosophy and literary tradition. This perished with the oligarchy, leaving only traces of its more elementary forms in the popular customs of the peasantry. It was, in its last days, no more than a literary tradition, passionately kept like the love letters of a lost mistress, but as much a matter of past things and bygone glories. It belonged, in reality, to the days of the independent city-states. With their fall, it had ceased to have meaning. The Egyptian worships and some of the Asiatic cults had more vitality, but the worship of Isis remained too local in conception. Its external power of appeal was limited. Its inward philosophical structure was suited to a type of mind which fell behind and dropped out of the battle when life became a desperate fight against odds. Mithraicism, in some respects the closest competitor of Christianity, was the particular cult of the army. It largely perished when the army dissolved. Many of its adherents of the higher grades probably fell on the field of battle during the numberless civil wars and frontier struggles of the last days. The power of Christianity rested, of course, upon its extraordinary Catholicity. It brought into integration a far larger number of elements than any of its competitors. It was a winepress into which went harvests of the most diverse intellectual effort, spiritual experience, and social tradition. The result was something which did not shield men from pain nor guard them from catastrophe, but braced them to action. Anything is possible to men if they will suffer and act. The theory that persecution makes men great is a very doubtful one. Persecution is frequently, perhaps usually, successful. The world is strewn with the dust of unprofitable martyrs. Persecution will wipe out anything except the truth. It was the element of truth, the element of life and vitality, that brought the early church, a mixed, often ragged, sometimes disreputable, occasionally magnificent army, struggling through to success. The battle it fought against its external competitors it carried on also within its own ranks. The form it finally took was one which gathered together in alliance the men who were ready to suffer and prepared to fight. 6. The degree as well as the nature of the influence which could be exerted on the Roman state by the Christian Church was profoundly affected by the structure of the two bodies. There was but one source from which the organization of a Christian church could spring, the still unorganized, untapped residuum of population which had not yet been drawn into the circle of authorized Roman institutions. The reason why that church arose from the humble and the weak, not among the great men of the world, is accordingly clear enough. The social organization of the upper and middle classes could not be converted or twisted or in any way transformed to suit objects and ideals which it was never designed to fulfill. There was no means by which any man or any minority of men could effect such a transformation from within. The men who founded the organizations of Roman society had seen to that. They had so arranged its structure that it could only be destroyed. It could never be changed. Hence, when the time came for change, it could not change and was therefore destroyed. The result was not to the benefit of anyone. It put back the progress of humanity, delayed its march, and cost it an untold penalty in the destruction of life and wealth and the frustration of happiness. It did not save a single valuable interest. It did not subserve even the lowest ends, let alone the highest. There was no fresh organization ready to step into the shoes of the old. The old organization had taken care to have no rivals. Like an oriental monarch, it had removed all its natural successors. The church was not an organization adapted for the conduct of ordinary secular life. It was a religious institution alone. It could not take over the work of the landlords and bankers and merchants of the Roman world. It could do no more than nourish and inspire the labors of those who refounded civilization. The beginning and the subsequent growth of the church conformed to the rules which govern the formation of all great social institutions. It began, as the rule is, with one man, and that man, as we should expect, had attributed to him a pedigree which classes him with the kings and aristocracies of the world. His first helpers and successors were, and here again the rules hold good, free men accustomed to liberty and to self-sufficing independence. The organization grew, and if it grew by the assimilation of men from the lower and unorganized section of the community, it was only because the other classes were already bound tight in the bonds of mutual association, so tight that to get free of them was almost an impossibility. Even so, there were recruits from those other classes who either took the risk of discovery or anticipated it by boldly sacrificing their positions. And, pursuing those rules which govern such institutions, the church acted not by collecting the views of its servile recruits and striking an average of opinion and doctrine, but by submitting them to the training of a discipline determined by men of a very different stamp. The slave learned not alone to act, but also to think and to be on the model of that mighty man who is descended from the kings of Judah. This was something of a nature much more significant than could be shown by any of the class organizations of the Roman civilization. It went nearer to the roots of reality. All the class organizations of Rome were by comparison overburdened with mere custom, subject to mere drift, or out of control and victimized by their own incoherence and inchoateness. None of them could get free from the dreadful drag that is constituted by the necessity of conforming to an average of opinion. 7. It is worthwhile to remind ourselves of one particular aspect of the rise of Christianity. In the reign of Tiberius took place a process which consisted in the gathering together in one brief set of principles, handy and convenient for propaganda, of the whole results of the social experience of the civilization of the ancient East, a civilization older than our own is now, and its grafting upon the civilization of the Mediterranean. 4,000 years and more of struggle, of success, of failure, of hope, of fear, of passionate aspiration and steady faith, culminating in one brilliant century as pregnant in its religious significance as the age of Pericles was in art, or the 19th century in scientific discovery. This human experience was brought into contact with the Roman world until its vitality began to run through the veins of that world and to change its nature. Rome had some 700 years of experience, most of it political and legal. Greece had perhaps 4 times as much, and its complete form was artistic and commercial, consummated in ideas of artistic expression and intellectual conception. But the East had a longer experience still, and the form into which she threw it was religious. Now, religious thought is much the most concentrated form of thinking possible to the human brain. It gives, as nothing else does, a set of values which can determine the relations of all other thoughts. What we need to appreciate before all else is the vastness of time, the immensity of the human experience, which went to form the set of values that entered the Western world under the name of the Christian faith. When it constructed around itself, as a means of expression, a ritual gathered from the familiar customs of mankind, a theology largely taken from Greek philosophy, and a canon law not free from the influence of Roman jurisprudence, it transformed all these things and gave them a coherence they had never before possessed by reorientating them according to one definite scale. Beside this, the ancient religion of Rome was a trifling thing which could not hold the attention or the affection of men. 8. Before the full results of the Christian movement could affect the Roman dominion, that dominion, as far as Western Europe was concerned, had collapsed into wreckage, and the Church, whether knowingly or not, was launched on a fresh pilgrimage to reconstruct another and a more comprehensive world. This is not the place in which to follow it. Let us return to the legacy of Tiberius, for there are yet 1 or 2 items in the account which must be reckoned up. The struggle between Tiberius and his foes, involving, as it did, the destruction of the house of Caesar and the paralysis of the senatorial oligarchy, influenced the subsequent development of the Roman world in ways which deserve more particular description in detail. The root problem of that contest was the impossibility of discovering any effective reason for halting in it. Neither moral obligation nor material interest was sufficient to supply an adequate cause. It was on this problem that the Roman polity, like the Greek, came to grief. To push a social struggle beyond a certain point is to disrupt or corrupt civilization. But where is this point? By what means is it to be discovered? and what motives can be found to compel men to pause when they perceive it? A modern man is not free to take up any attitude of superiority on this question. Our greater wisdom still remains to be proved. Civilization is not simply based upon compromise. It is itself, in its own nature, like marriage, a compromise, continually in being, continually renewed from hour to hour. On the effective construction and maintenance of this compromise depends the continuance of civilized life. It is easy not to make it, easy to follow ideas to their extreme logical conclusion. But in that case, both victors and vanquished have lost all and gained nothing. There must be a consent to lose. In the absence of this amicable arrangement, there is no alternative but to construct society so rigidly that competition is altogether excluded. But it is highly questionable whether this cure is not as bad as the disease. Hence, we are confronted by an apparently baffling and insoluble problem, which can only be circumvented by attacking it from a totally different quarter, namely, by turning our attention to the creation of an actual change in men's minds themselves. Not a change in the way we educate ourselves, but a change in the selves we educate. One of the essential doctrines of Christianity was the possibility of this change in ourselves. There never was any question but that the number of men capable of it is small, but these are the salt of the earth who preserve it from destruction. That we cannot change human nature is a principle that few will dispute. But if a certain number of men cannot empty themselves of the motives and aspirations of the ordinary sensual life, then we must be prepared to contemplate the possibility that every civilization ends in a deadlock. But in the absence of such a solution, the ready resort is to rigid organization. The defense of the military emperors forced this rigidity upon Roman life. It slowly destroyed the vitality of Roman industry and commerce, and this, in turn, undermined the foundation on which the power of the military order was built. To a certain extent, the Roman Empire shared this rigidity with all its forerunners. The necessity of control forced upon all of them alike the same tendency to a system of caste, the same isolation of one class from another, the sharp division of professions, the system of regulated and closed guilds in industry. This question is not one of theory. We are not arguing an abstract case. Control by the central government was forced upon ancient civilization by the most practical necessities. Competition, attrition, and the survival of the strongest left in existence those that heeded the necessity of control and wiped out those that neglected it. The Roman state was a victor tottering up to the winning post out of a large field of starters. The danger of such rigidity is that the state, which is so organized, can be easily and sometimes quite suddenly destroyed. To make a serious breach anywhere in the fabric is liable to bring the whole structure down bodily. And this is, in fact, the fate that befell the civilization of later Rome. It never recovered from the catastrophes of the 3rd century. It could not recover, for a rigid system of social organization has no generous reserves of intelligent amateurs. When the Irish and the English got their first grip on Roman Britain by the simple expedient of destroying whatsoever they could reach, and then waiting until the body politic bled to death, they were following a method which the Turks afterwards applied to the Byzantine Empire. In both cases, it succeeded but too well. 9. The policy of Tiberius upon the Rhine frontier, influenced in part, as the story has shown, by the political struggle, was wise as far as it went, but it left many issues outstanding. The conquest of Britain must have become a fixed intention with the Roman army chiefs after the recall of Germanicus. The condition of domestic politics, however, made it necessary that a generation should pass before such a design could be realized. Some 10 years after Germanicus left the Rhine, the Frisians were provoked to revolt and made good their independence. It was after this that we can trace the first beginnings of a movement which was destined to go far and have vast consequences. The Chauci began a little raiding. In A.D. 47, they came down to the coasts of Gaul under a leader named Ganascus, a deserter from the Roman service, and by race a Frisian Caniniphate. They had found, or rediscovered, the seaway south, which Drusus and Germanicus had so graphically demonstrated for their benefit. Gnaeus Domitius Corbulo repressed their piracies, and once more reoccupied Frisia. It was Corbulo's intention to stop these raids at the source, but to do this would have meant the crossing of the Ems, and such a reopening of the German question was a matter for the imperial government, which proceeded to consider the whole subject. The policy of Drusus and Germanicus, stopped by Tiberius, was now reversed, and a return made to that of Gaius Julius Caesar. Corbulo was recalled from Frisia, and the northern bank of the Rhine, although it remained under Roman supervision, was definitely evacuated. Attention was turned from inland Germany to the North Sea. The conquest of Britain marked the next stage of a change which developed at first very slowly, but afterwards with increasing rapidity. The raid of the Chauci in A.D. 47 indicated the start of an era of shipbuilding in the north and the gradual transference of the main strategic problems from the land to the water. 250 years later, the Chauci had grown into those seafaring Saxons against whom southeastern Britain was ringed with fortifications, as it never was ringed against the Spaniard and the Frenchman in later days. Africa had found no answer to the Roman legionary. Asia had found a partial answer, the mounted bowman. Northern Europe found the complete and effective answer, the seagoing ship. Britain became, and for ages remained, the chief advanced base against the northern fleets, the central strategic point for which they fought, and the possession of which determined the seat of power. The occupation of Britain was thus no casual episode. It was a serious measure of policy, thoroughly executed from the first, and permanently maintained. How much Gaius Julius definitely foresaw, or how far he judged by the pure instinct of the born strategist, we can never know, but he was, in any case, right. Whatsoever opinions may be entertained respecting the motives which led the Roman government to occupy Britain, one thing is certain. It gave Rome the secure possession of the Rhine frontier, which was never wrested from her until Britain was lost again. On many occasions that frontier was broken, and Gaul and Spain, and even Africa, were overrun. But as long as Britain was held, the line was again restored. The Saxons never won Britain. Not until the Angles took over the task was the project successfully achieved, in those days when Theodoric the Ostrogoth was trekking into Italy with ox and wagon, and the Vandals were reigning in Africa, and Clodovec the Frank was busy trying ineffectually to set up some sort of minor kingdom along the Rhine. The success of the Angles, none too complete at first, but sufficient, resulted in the unpinning of the whole scheme of defense in the western provinces of Rome. The empire was strong enough to wipe out the Vandals and to reconquer Italy from the successors of Theodoric, but Gaul was never recovered. Clodovac was a man inferior to a score of forerunners who had failed. He is not for a moment to be compared with such men as Irmin and Marbod. Nevertheless, with Britain in English hands, he succeeded in founding the Frankish kingdom, which was to play so great a part in subsequent history. 10. To sum up, the reign of Tiberius and the events which then took place determined much subsequent history. That age saw the beginning of a new scheme of social values in the foundation of the Christian faith. And though it did not see the conquest of Britain, it saw the way to it prepared by the definite abandonment of the attempt to absorb Germany into the Roman world state. It was during the reign of Tiberius that the attempt to found a stable hereditary or cooptative monarchy for Rome broke down, so that the monarchy remained in principle elective. Out of these three elements grew some of the determining forces that have molded the modern civilization in which we live. For the first provided the basis of a new and wider civilization, and the second secured the strategic military position which was to give this new civilization the power of maintaining itself and of spreading across the globe. And the third made sure that the old civilization of Rome should come to a deadlock and perish. These results cannot quite be called accidental. They grew by an almost terrifying logic out of the precedent circumstances and the relationships of men. But the failure of Drusus and Germanicus affected the future almost as profoundly as their success would have done. They had shaken the North out of its tribal institutions. Dominance passed into the hands of barbarian monarchies, which had learned from the Romans the art of politics, and which based the beginnings of the modern national state upon the principle of the military guild which Gaius Julius Caesar had founded. The stability and survival of these states was, for the most part, due to a very simple advantage. They could rely upon royal families, which produced, generation after generation, men of a sufficient standard of robustness and intelligence to do the work of government and to give it continuity. The whole history of the political state in Europe for close upon 2,000 years past has been intertwined with this problem of the succession of the head of the state. The house of Theodoric the Ostrogoth could not maintain its quality, and the Ostrogothic kingdom in Italy perished. The Visigoths of Spain could not maintain it, and the Gothic kingdom fell. The Franks struggled up to power on the genetic virtues of the Merovingians and the Arnulfings. The English, when the robust Anglian house of Mercia dwindled, barely survived through the weaker line of Wessex. No greater error could be made than to imagine that this question of succession is artificial or unimportant. It is a problem on which depends the continuity of a creative control of the state, and that is the actual identity of the state itself. It first comes before us when we see the Roman state endeavoring to remodel itself by the active exercise of creative intelligence. We see that endeavor repeatedly fail with a gradually decreasing degree of failure through the fall of Gaius Gracchus, the abdication of Sulla, and the assassination of Gaius Julius Caesar. We can see it take on definite meaning when Augustus bends his mind to give continuity to the Principate. Its full significance dawns upon us with the problems of Tiberius and the struggle he waged. The lives and happiness of hundreds of millions of human beings have hung upon it. The rise and fall of states has hung upon it. For if it were nothing else, and it was often much more, It was the power which controlled or lost control of the awful forces of party and interest. Men at large are not their own masters. They are not isolated individuals. They move in vast bodies, which are not self-determined, but are drawn and swayed by the tidal forces of opinion and interest. It is only when the control gives way and lets these forces free that men realize one fact about themselves, that they are swept passively into social and political catastrophes by forces which they cannot stop, divert, or change, and before which they, their feelings, their hopes, their wishes, and all the kindly habits of civilization are straws. End of Chapter 13. Read by Mark Harrington, Framingham, Massachusetts. End of Tiberius Caesar by George Philip Baker.